everybody. Welcome back to the show. Today I had the pleasure of speaking with Hans Amato from Mentalite.com for the second time in a row. Today we discussed all things DHT and hair loss related. It's pretty common knowledge in mainstream medicine that DHT is the main culprit behind male pattern baldness. However, today we discuss some contrarian views in regards to what else could be causing this pattern. It is well known that finasteride, dutasteride, and all other types of drugs like this that reduce DHT both in the blood and the scalp can come with some pretty harsh side effects such as low libido, poor muscle mass, brain fog, all sorts of issues, because DHT, as we talk about in the show, is a very, very essential hormone for men. And lowering this is probably not the best strategy if you're looking to optimize your health. So today we discuss other alternatives to help mitigate hair loss and what could be causing some issues in regards to that besides DHT. I hope you guys enjoy the podcast. Please let us know down below what you think of it and how we can improve for next time. Thanks so much. Enjoy the show. All right, so today we're going to be discussing all things DHT and hair loss related. Hans, if you want to just introduce yourself really quickly and kind of cover the main topics for today, that would be great.
Yeah, so I'm an independent researcher. I have a website called Mentalite, where I research many things in terms of metabolism, hormones, neurotransmitters. That's kind of like my passion, including exercise, but I don't write so much about that. So my passion is basically researching these hormones, neurotransmitters, and I like to find what really works and go against the dogma. Not necessarily, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but I like to go to, what really works. Like there's a lot of theories as to why things work, but it's not always proven. Like you see that the application of that science doesn't always pan out. So that's kind of like what I do. If it doesn't work out, like there's something missing, research been overlooked, there is contradictory evidence, and I would like to investigate everything for and against any kind of topic. And then once I've seen the research, I make a decision to what I believe. And always, if there's some new research coming out, I will always change my view. So that's kind of like how I approach the research and the kind of articles I write and the content I create. So you have me on. We want to talk about DHT and hair loss specifically. What's the first thing you want me to follow away on?
Yeah, so I guess this idea, I think, will be shocking to a lot of listeners. It's very well known. You see it all the time on ads. You see it on bodybuilding forums that DHT is the cause of hair loss. Male pattern baldness is almost specifically a 5-AR reductase issue. And that's why things like finasteride and dutasteride have been created in pharmacy to try and block DHT, both in the blood, but also on the scalp. So I'm curious what made you get into this topic and start to kind of question this philosophy of DHT being the real cause of hair loss.
So as I mentioned, I am interested in hormones and neurotransmitters. So I would like to know as much as possible about a certain compound. So if someone say testosterone is good or DHT is good, but then also says it's bad, I want to know, like, why is it bad? And is it really bad the way they say it to be? And then I want to research it specifically so that DHT and hair loss, or more, I would say like hair loss specifically, isn't my passion. It's not something that I research full time, but I have researched it because it's in line with, like, for example, DHT that I'm very interested in. So I want to know, like, what will it cause hair loss? And it's something that I have to be concerned about if I want to be focusing on boosting my DHT.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I mean, I'll say right off the bat, for those listening and not viewing, Hans is fortunate to have a very beautiful hairline. So despite, I imagine, having quite high DHT levels from all the things you've done to optimize that, you still seem to have a great full head of hair. So I'd say for myself, I'm the same. I've managed to anecdotally double my DHT from around 40 to around 80 above range. And I've noticed almost zero side effects, only really benefits. So just from an anecdotal experience, I've kind of realized over the time that, it probably doesn't make sense that it's one specific hormone that's causing a cascade of issues with hair loss. As I think you're going to get into, it's probably a breakdown of many different metabolites causing this issue over the long term. So if you wanted to get into that about, potential other causes of hair loss or male pattern baldness, that would be great.
So the first thing, when we talk about alternatives to DHT, what else is causing hair loss? I would say like the first thing you notice when someone starts losing hair is they are going through a stressful period, or they have been going through a stressful period for a long time. So stress, in my opinion, is kind of like the leading cause of hair loss, and not just the AGA kind, but any kind of hair loss that causes hair thinning and calcification, fibrosis in the scalp and everything like that. So that all starts with stress. And then obviously stress causes many different things to happen in the body. For example, you waste your nutrients, you get gut issues. So you're not digesting your food properly, you're not absorbing your nutrients properly, you're urinating out the magnesium and your potassium. Those are very important intracellular minerals. So you can't produce your energy properly, you can't oxygenate the tissue very effectively. So just stress causes a lot of negative things to happen. So also, for example, acute stress, where you get an acute increase in cortisol, can be beneficial, it can save your life, it has anti-inflammatory properties. And I should say that the chronic stress, the low-grade chronic stress, that's the problem. So obviously, if you get the low-grade chronic stress and you get the high-grade chronic stress, and obviously the higher your chronic stress is, the faster your health will start to deteriorate. So this is not just with the hair loss. And you will always notice that someone that's experiencing hair loss has other symptoms as well. But there's obviously exceptions where people will bald when they're like basically 20, start to bald, and they will be thought to not have any comorbidities, so to speak. But most people that start to bald have many other comorbidities as well. And they've been either eating a poor diet, having gut issues. There's many links to the gut specifically, and hair loss, and thyroid, and those kind of stuff. So I would say stress first, that is causing the hair loss, and then everything else that follows it. So when you're also stressed, you have nutrient deficiencies and stuff like that. Let's say, for example, vitamin D deficiency, you're having a sodium deficiency. The synthesis of aldosterone, that upregulates the synthesis of parathyroid hormone. Both of these can produce vascular calcification and fibrosis, which is implicated in hair loss. And because if your body can't oxygenate and provide nutrients to the scalp, your hair can't grow properly. It will become more catabolic and will start to fall out. That's why people get that shiny part at the top of their head. That's kind of like the fibrosis happening. And that's just a long-term process of not having enough blood flow to that area. So again, everything comes back to the stress. But I would say those people that bald really soon in their life, I would say that is basically due to epigenetic modifications. It could be their mother went through stress, she was malnourished, they had trouble during their upbringing. For example, they had stress, they had some kind of abandonment issue. Anything could have happened that put them in a stress state where they gotten some kind of epigenetic modification that predisposed them to hair loss. So in that regard, I wouldn't say perhaps DHT is involved to a degree, but I would say there's many other different things that's involved. I would say it's really reductionistic to think that DHT is the cause of hair loss when there are so many different things also involved, like stress, inflammatory markers, polyunsaturated fats, lack of blood flow, and DHT cannot be the cause of all of those. There's so many different things happening at the same time as well.
Yeah, I'd have to ask, going into this theory, one of the big things with repeat philosophy is that estrogen is a stress hormone, and that will raise prolactin and serotonin and lower thyroid production. So I'm curious if you've come across anything that suggests that potentially estrogen could be a cause of this as well. Thinking back to watching a lot of sports, you'll notice that there's certain sports in particular where it seems men are almost always bald. I'm thinking endurance events. My background came from doing a lot of endurance events, which is a very stressful thing on the body, running for hours and hours on end, raising cortisol up. These guys for sure do not have high testosterone or high DHT. They are stressed out of their minds, probably are hypogonadal, as many studies have suggested that endurance exercise over time will lower your testosterone levels drastically. And that was my experience as well. So there must be other things, such as perhaps cortisol or estrogen, that could be causing this. And I'm just curious if you've actually seen this, not just anecdotally like I have, but actually in any research.
I would say I haven't directly seen that like for example, a study where they give men estrogen and they lose hair, or at least an in vitro study where they treat these cells with estrogen and they lose hair. But they could be, but I haven't seen one yet. But I would say when you look at people, you can clearly say what you just mentioned, like endurance athletes, they have a higher risk of, not being in an optimal state. So what happens is basically their testosterone starts to drop and their estrogen kind of like either remains the same or goes up. So that ratio becomes imbalanced. So again, like this is the testosterone to estrogen ratio, it's the testosterone to cortisol ratio. But one study that I have seen that was quite interesting is that melatonin has been shown to help against prevent hair loss and actually help to regrow hair. And one of the things that melatonin does is it lowers and antagonizes the estrogen receptor alpha in the hair follicles. So if estrogen is so good for hair regrowth, why does melatonin that helps to regrow it lower it? So that's one thing. And there's another thing like DHT is also one of the main antagonists to estrogen. So there is a theory that the body in a compensatory mechanism upregulates DHT to help to control the estrogen. And I would also say that estrogen is a really strong stimulant, like you mentioned, of prolactin and serotonin, both of which are involved with hair loss. For example, it's been shown that prolactin directly promotes the catagen phase and reduces the anagen phase. So the anagen phase is where you are kind of like the anabolic phase where the hair follicle is growing, and the catagen phase is where the hair follicle is like catabolic and it's shrinking back. So people tend to say like it's DHT that's causing that, but the research show that DHT doesn't actually directly cause that. When you just treat the hair follicle with DHT, it doesn't cause the shrinkage of the hair follicle. It needs something else, like some inflammatory marker, or aldosterone or serotonin, something that works kind of like together with the DHT to cause the hair loss. So prolactin in itself immediately causes hair loss. It shrinks the hair follicle and makes the hair fall out, also promotes fibrosis. Serotonin in itself causes inflammation and causes vasoconstriction, prevents the proper oxygenation of the tissue. So that those two is promoted by estrogen. So that's why estrogen is not a good thing that you want to have elevated.
That's super interesting. And just so I get this correct too for myself, estrogen can raise prolactin, but also prolactin will then feed back into estrogen as well. It's kind of like a synonymous thing going on. They can both raise each other up. So it's kind of like this cycle that keeps occurring.
Yeah, so prolactin is a very strong inhibitor of serogenesis. So it lowers testosterone and DHT and actually shifts that testosterone to estrogen ratio exactly in the way you don't want it to. So it does come down to the ratios, more so to speak. So you don't necessarily want crushed estrogen or crushed cortisol. Obviously, you need those a little bit, but it's again about the ratio that you want. You want that high androgen state to be protective against the other ones. It's like a simple analogy would be, for example, the polyunsaturated to saturated fat ratio. Whereas if you give animals like a corn oil diet, they get all kinds of inflammatory conditions and heart inflammation. But when you add in, what was that, where they saturate the peanut oil, I forgot exactly the process that they use, but it's a process where they completely saturate the unsaturated fat. And when they gave the rats that saturated fat, it completely protected against the harmful effects of the polyunsaturated fats. So the same thing with the androgens being highly protective against the cortisol, the estrogen, the serotonin, anything that can be pathological.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, this makes a lot of sense just thinking about it logically. You know, if you're a bodybuilder who starts injecting steroids and you start noticing drastic increases in, you know, hair shedding or actual male pattern baldness, it would make sense that, you know, if you're raising testosterone, it's aromatizing into estrogen, which will then also cause an increase in prolactin, and testosterone itself is very sympathetic and can raise cortisol as well. So, you know, what Hans is getting at here is that it's not just like testosterone and DHT. There are many different things that are being converted downstream that could be causing the issues, such as estrogen or prolactin, or even I'd love to get into the difference between raising nitric oxide versus CO2, because I know that Danny Roddy, which I recommend everybody check his channel out and read his book, Hair Like a Fox. He talks a lot about increasing CO2 rather than nitric oxide, because that also can be raised in a stressful state. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so nitric oxide, there's three enzymes that can synthesize this. One is the endothelial, which is basically the one that helps to prevent high blood pressure. they would say typically. Then you get the neuronal one and you get the inducible one. So the inducible one is induced by inflammation or endotoxin. So again, this is the gut hair loss connection, where you have any kind of gut problems that's causing inflammation, leaking endotoxin into the system, or any kind of bacterial byproduct, it's going to stimulate the inducible nitric oxide synthase. So the problem with that is the inducible one creates about 1,000 times more nitric oxide than the endothelial nitric oxide synthase. So that becomes a big problem, because now all that nitric oxide is highly damaging. It acts as a free radical, causes oxidative stress and inflammation in the body. It can also combine the nitric oxide combined with superoxide in the electron transport chain, if that leaks out, and create peroxynitrite, which is a very powerful oxidant. Causes a lot of problems like DNA damage, protein damage, lipid damage. It just wreaks havoc to everything in the body. So excess nitric oxide is definitely a bad thing. Also causes vascular permeability, leakage of mitochondrial proteins like all over the place. And once your mitochondria don't work properly anymore, you become susceptible to autoimmune conditions, because now the immune system starts reacting to the mitochondrial fragments floating around in the blood. So nitric oxide is a very powerful inhibitor of the electron transport chain at cytochrome C oxidase. And that's also where the electrons flow. Superoxide can leak at the cytochrome C oxidase, react with the nitric oxide, where it's been inhibited, creating peroxynitrite, like I just mentioned. So very powerful combination at wrecking your cellular health if you want to maximize your nitric oxide levels. So obviously, if you do it naturally, like you eat like spinach, I don't like spinach, I'm not a fan of vegetables, but spinach or beets or celery or something like that, you can also significantly increase your nitric oxide levels. But because these vegetables have some antioxidants, they can protect the nitric oxide to prevent kind of like this DNA damage, lipid peroxidation, and so on. But if you use something like arginine or Viagra or some kind of nitric oxide booster, you have a significant risk of getting lipid peroxidation, DNA damage, and those kind of stuff. So initially, someone might actually feel better when they use something like that, because initially you get that boost in nitric oxide, you get some kind of relief. But in the long term, that benefits go away. And I should also say that too much nitric oxide, by inhibiting the mitochondria, creates more reactive oxygen species in general. And that reactive oxygen species actually uncouple endothelial nitric oxide synthase, meaning that endothelial nitric oxide synthase doesn't produce nitric oxide anymore. It now produces superoxide in turn. So nitric oxide is like an enemy of itself in a way, uncoupling its own enzyme that's supposed to produce and prevent the hypertension. So the whole goal is like, don't try to focus on boosting your nitric oxide, rather focus on keeping the gut clean, inhibiting that inducible nitric oxide synthase, and then everything else should fall into place. And also make sure that you're eating a nutrient-dense diet. So for example, your body can synthesize nitric oxide, like everyone knows, but it needs nutrients, like it needs the B vitamins specifically, like folic acid, or at least folate. You don't want to be supplementing folic acid. So you can go folate from the diet, specifically animal proteins. I like to get mine from liver specifically, or something like orange juice. The B vitamins like vitamin B1, 2, 3 is necessary for the folate cycle, which is connected to the BH4 cycle. So the BH4 cycle creates BH4, which is a cofactor for nitric oxide synthase. And that BH4 in itself is actually also antioxidant, so it can prevent like excess reactive oxygen species. So the point rather is to reduce excess reactive oxygen species, because that is promoting inflammation, oxidative stress in the scalp, causing hair loss. So that is lowering the oxidative stress, and that's not the nitric oxide synthase. So you want to fix the oxidative stress. Always comes back to sorry, I'm confusing these terms. It's getting into my head.
A lot of terms.
Yeah, so the free radicals are lowering your nitric oxide. So if you can lower the free radicals, your nitric oxide automatically will start to increase and normalize. That's the approach. But to touch up on CO2 is also a very important vasodilator and tissue oxygenator. That's the most important thing. It promotes the tissue oxygenation. If you don't have enough CO2 in the body, so what CO2 does is basically displaces the oxygen from the red blood cell so it can actually enter into the cells. If you don't have enough CO2, that effect can't take place. You can't actually oxygenate the tissue. So a lot of people have sleep apnea, they do mouth breathing, they have nasal congestion, so they can't do proper breathing. They can't retain that CO2 that they produce. So they can't oxygenate their tissue very properly. So they get cold hands and feet, they get hair loss, they get cold ears, nose, so all of the extremity parts start to become cold, which people would deem to be a nitric oxide deficiency, but it's actually also part of excess reactive oxygen species hypothyroidism. So yeah, it comes down to lower your reactive oxygen species and increase your CO2, but you can't produce enough CO2 if you have an excess of nitric oxide that's inhibiting the mitochondria to produce energy. So for example, red light, they're very effective at displacing nitric oxide from the cytochrome C, modulating the intracellular water of the mitochondria, optimizing just the whole cellular function to produce energy. So that lowers oxidative stress, enhances the bioavailability of your nitric oxide, produces CO2, produces tissue oxygenation, produces energy. And that's kind of like the process that you want to mimic. You don't want to expose, you can't really expose yourself to red light 24/7. So you want to mimic a state like that and reduce the excess oxidative stress so that nitric oxide in itself can normalize and that your CO2 can be optimized. That's going to help with the oxygenation of the tissue to produce energy.
Yeah, so it really comes down to trying to increase mitochondrial density and efficiency at a cellular level. And I think there's, even in the mainstream science world, you're seeing a lot more of these devices of red light being shown, shined directly on the scalp. And anecdotally, it sounds like some people are having some pretty great results from that. I imagine if you were to do that whole body, you'd get even more profound results. And then, tying the things that you're talking about, cleaning up the gut, making sure that there's no infections or bacterial overload, or, SIBO is a big one that I dealt with for a long time. So if you get things like, bloating or a lot of gas or tinnitus, these are all signs that there's a big endotoxin load. Brain fog is another common one. As you mentioned, cold hands, cold feet. These are all really easy ways to tell if you're in a stress state, whether it's coming directly from the gut or some other, viral load perhaps that's causing stress on the body. And get back to the athletes, just because that's what I can relate to so well, is you see these endurance athletes and what are they doing all the time? Breathing through their mouth constantly, both during exercise, at rest. They're just always mouth breathers. And a lot of athletes actually tend to have sleep apnea issues. Myself, I have had many years of insomnia-like bouts, mostly because of breathing through my mouth. And I found doing things like mouth taping or using aspirin to increase CO2 production before bed. These are all like basic things you can do to test out that are pretty safe. B1 is another one, to test out to try and increase CO2 before bed. And it seems to help, for me at least, with clearing out the nasal passage. And just relating it to nature, if you ever look at an animal, you will never see them breathing through their mouth unless there is something wrong.
Yeah.
I forget who exactly had mentioned that to me at first. I think it may have been Elliot Holtz back in like 2012 or something, or Paul Chek or one of those guys, but they were mentioning how, like, if you look at a bird or a deer or any sort of animal in its natural state, they will never be breathing through their mouth unless they are stressed the fuck out. So they're, if they're getting chased by a lion, sure, they're going to be breathing through their mouth. If they got an infection, if they have Lyme disease, if they have something stressful going on, that's the only time you'll see them breathing through their mouth. Even when they're moving, they're breathing through their nose. So now when I like to go for an occasional jog on the trails, I'm always being mindful of breathing through the nose rather than the mouth, because it keeps you in that parasympathetic state and keeps you more relaxed, and it's a lot less stressful on the body. Yeah,
for sure. There's a few books on this I've read. Breath by James Nestor and The Oxygen Advantage by Patrick McKeown. I think those are two really good books when it comes to realizing at least the benefits of nose breathing, how important it is. So if you're doing mouth breathing, you're exhaling a significant amount of carbon dioxide compared to nose breathing. And if you nose breathe, you retain that. And with nose breathing, you actually have some nitric oxide going to your system as well. And one of the cool benefits of nose breathing is that when you breathe that complete breath into your lung, that air, when it reaches your lung, is already body temperature. Like, that's how quickly it speeds up it heats up the air when it goes to your nasal cavity. But when you mouth breathe, that cold air is hitting your lung versus optimized temperature, which also has a negative effect if it's like too cold in your lungs all the time.
Yeah, totally. So are there any things besides, to summarize, we've covered about, estrogen, prolactin, serotonin, cortisol. We've covered nitric oxide and CO2. how would you suggest people start implementing certain strategies or dietary methodologies to try and prevent hair loss? If someone, for myself, I know that it runs in my family. I think some of it may be genetic, but as we know, genetics are not everything. And if we are able to optimize our environment, we can usually at least push that for much later down the road than it may have come if in a more stressful state. So
yeah, the first thing that there's about three things that I would make sure that I'm doing on a very consistent basis, and that the first one is stress management. Like if I'm prone to baldness, I would be stress managing like a maniac. And then I would also make sure my gut is not irritated at all. I would be eating the least gut irritating foods as possible, and that would be simple like animal products and fruit juices. So if it's a fruit juice, it's less likely to be gut irritating. For some people, dairy can be gut irritating. At least for me, it's not. Like some people have better success with goat milk if they want something that's less gut irritating. So make sure my gut is not irritated. And then also I'm going to make sure I'm getting all of my micronutrients as best as possible. So this is important. There's actually a study in it, I think it was only in animals, that showed that if they were nutrient deficient for a long time, by, for example, eating a poor diet, and then they were given a supplement, they needed significantly higher doses to actually correct that deficiency for a very long time, basically for the rest of their lives. So the thing is, I know a lot of people have been eating insufficiently, they've been nutrient deficient for a very long time, and they've been very stressed, which also wastes these nutrients. So they need higher amounts of nutrients than just the RDA. And I know a lot of people, when like I work with a lot of people, and when I log their diets into Chronometer, it's like staggering the amount of micronutrients that they consume. It's like, you want to cringe when you see that. And you shouldn't just be aiming for the RDA. You want to go for several times the RDA, especially if you've been an athlete that have been stressed, like not overtraining, but there's a lot of like endurance athletes that that train many hours more than what is considered healthy, just because they're an athlete, So, and then on top of that, they eat a poor diet. So they are wasting nutrients away rapidly, and they're not consuming enough. And that's creating a deficiency for many years that creates a state that where you need to overload your system with nutrients for a very long period of time to prevent future deficiencies. And obviously, as you get a deficiency, that's going to accelerate the possibility of getting some form of hair loss. So obviously, when it comes to stress management, there's quite a few things that you can do. The first thing I would do is just make sure you sleep properly. Make sure your relationships are in check. You don't want to be engaging in some kind of relationship that's freaking you out, that's stressing you out, whether it be your spouse, your friends, something like that. Just make sure you settle relationships in a way that is not stressful. So either that would require that you improve yourself in a way where you are no longer reactive, because when you are reactive towards someone else, that's more likely that that person is also going to be reactive. But that again links back to estrogen. So estrogen can make you a very aggressive, lash out kind of person, and also serotonin. So it's been shown that if you block serotonin, that makes you less of an aggressive person. Sleep, relationships, exercise can be great for stress management. Make sure you nose breathe. People, when they tend to get anxious, they start to unconsciously, very shallow breathing, but mouth breathing. Just make sure you're breathing slowly, not so much deep, just slow, like 6 seconds in, 6 seconds out. That's kind of like one of the simplest way to make sure you're retaining that CO2. So more of a slow breathing than a deep breathing, and you'll just notice that you get that warm rush of CO2 going through your body and improving circulation when you breathe that way. So that's kind of like the biggest things that I would focus on when it comes to lifestyle and diet. In terms of topicals, I really like uric acid, or urea combined with taurine, and you can also throw in a little bit of essential oils that have been shown to help to prevent hair loss, like rosemary or something like that. So the urea and the taurine are strong antioxidants, and they promote blood flow into the scalp and can help to prevent the hair loss and stuff like that. They're also osmolytes, so they help to what's the right word, to make sure the water content of the cell remains stable. They don't lose their water, become overhydrated or something like that. And the very interesting I wanted to mention is when it comes to dietary calcium intake, like one of the things that promote hair loss is calcification. So as I already mentioned, aldosterone and parathyroid hormone promotes tissue calcification. So if you take a statin or something like that, that can actually inhibit the production of your vitamin K2 that can prevent tissue calcification. So that predisposes you to getting some kind of hair loss or calcification, whether it be in your arteries or, eventually stimulating hair loss. So dietary calcium has been shown to lower intracellular calcium. So it's the intracellular calcium that promotes basically all the pathological states of reactive oxygen species production. It puts the cell in a hyperexcited state, similar to estrogen. So dietary calcium helps to prevent the accumulation of intracellular calcium, which is obviously a very good thing. The reason they say it does this is by lowering the active vitamin D. So parathyroid hormone activates vitamin D from the storage form to the active form, which then promotes the influx of calcium into a cell and the outflux of magnesium. So again, this mimics the stress state. So make sure you get enough sunlight. This is very, very important, especially in the morning, to entrain the circadian rhythm. And then make sure you eat some calcium to also suppress the active vitamin D and suppress your parathyroid hormone. And interestingly enough, this parathyroid hormone and aldosterone system are basically interlinked, that the one system can activate the other system. So most likely, if you have high blood pressure, you also have elevated parathyroid hormone and tissue calcification. And this is not just implicated in hair loss, but cardiovascular disease, that plaque formation, calcification in your arteries just in general, leading to heart attack, those kind of stuff. So again, like comorbidities is much in line with hair loss. And then people's like, okay, I'm going to take finasteride and that's going to lower my DHT, but you're still going to die of, some kind of cardiovascular disease or metabolic syndrome because you're not addressing the root cause. That's the thing, the root cause. DHT is not the root cause of hair loss.
Yeah, and I would say even if we find out that DHT is a big part of it, I think, comes a point when you have to realize, do you want to lose your hair or do you want to lose everything else? Like DHT is so important for so many different other things regarding health. Just getting a little philosophical here, like hair is very much just a vanity thing. It really doesn't, it's not going to affect your life drastically. Like, yeah, I get it. I don't want to lose my hair either. That would stress me out. But like hair is just like anything else in a lot of modern society. It's just an aesthetic. It's, like the same thing as me wearing a nice t-shirt. It's not going to actually affect my blood pressure or my insulin sensitivity or how well I sleep at night, all these different things, which DHT is known to do. Like DHT drastically improves insulin sensitivity, drastically improves blood pressure, cardiovascular health overall. It improves libido, it improves drive, muscular strength and performance. So do you really want to lower all of that just to potentially push off your hair loss a few years? For me personally, I made the decision, like, I'm not going to ever touch stuff like that. I would much rather go through the process of losing my hair over time than detrimentally affect my health in a cascade of many different ways. So just something to keep in mind.
I should add that actually a few years ago, my wife and I, we were going through a really stressful period. And I actually started to losing my hair like there on like that typical horseshoe shape, but not severe, like about an inch going in. And after we got out of the stressful period, like initially I didn't notice it. I just thought like, this is odd. Did I always have that? This is odd. Like I didn't always think I had that kind of like pattern. And then when we got out of it, like automatically the stress disappeared, or at least significantly reduced. The diet improved significantly. The environment improved significantly. So there's many different factors that can influence your stress levels, and all of those improved. And suddenly, when the stress dropped for me, hair regrowth followed. And the thing is, like, if you remain in that stressful condition, you're going to use probably finasteride to block your DHT. But there's a possibility that's not even going to stop the hair loss because it's being promoted by inflammation, cortisol, aldosterone, stress, inflammation in general, lack of blood flow. And then I should also mention that finasteride does not regrow hair. So the best it can do is just stop the further progression of hair loss at best to a degree. Some people get 100% stopping of that symptoms. Other people don't. They just slow the process eventually. So like you mentioned, you're eventually going to end up with hair loss in any way, but now you're using something that lowers your DHT, that's going to negatively impact your mood and your sexual function and many other things of your health. And you have to fix the underlying metabolic condition resolve the problems. Like blocking DHT is not going to do that for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm really fascinated. So you were mentioning earlier about urea, using that topically. I have never heard of this before. That's a very new one, I think, to many listeners, probably. Can you dive a little bit deeper into that topic?
So urea is actually a very strong antioxidant and an osmolyte. So if baldness and hair loss is caused by oxidative stress and a reduction in proper cellular function, then you want to improve your cellular function. You want to improve the water structure. Like that's one of the benefits of red light. It optimizes the water structure of the cell. And that's one of the things that estrogen and polyunsaturated fats does, is they negatively influence the cellular structure of the cell. So they make it in a hyper water state, like it swells in some cases, but in other cases it becomes yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it can also become too dehydrated. So like you want to optimize the water structure of the cell, the water content. So urea can do that, and it also prevents reactive oxygen species production, like it quenches it. And it also is very strong against peroxynitrite. So that's very important, because if you are exposed to EMF, one of the things that happens, you get an influx of intracellular calcium. There we have the intracellular calcium again, that stimulates the production of nitric oxide in the cell. So again, nitric oxide reacting with the superoxide in the cell, creating peroxynitrite, very damaging, destroys the mitochondria basically. So urea can quench that peroxynitrite, which is very, very important to protect the cell. So antioxidant optimizes the water structure. That's kind of like the main reasons why I want to use it. And taurine in itself is like part of that combination. It's kind of like the same thing, very strong anti-inflammatory, prevents the influx of intracellular calcium and anti-inflammatory. So it just protects the cell and puts it in a state of optimal functioning to produce energy. And that's kind of like what you want. You want the cell to be producing energy efficiently, because that's in a state where it minimizes reactive oxygen species production.
Gotcha. So I wonder if something like magnesium topically as well would help with that, knowing that that will help regulate the amount of intracellular calcium that's going on.
Yeah, for sure. I think like combining urea, taurine, and the magnesium would be a great idea. Yeah. You could even throw in something like niacinamide, maybe some caffeine or aspirin. Aspirin great against inflammation as well. And the niacinamide obviously also helps to protect like against DNA damage in the cell, and it's necessary to produce NAD, which is then essential for producing energy in the cell.
Yeah, that's super cool. I remember seeing pictures. I think Danny Roddy had posted it once on a podcast that he was doing, showing that just improving thyroid with natural NDT, natural desiccated thyroid, that the people lost a lot of weight, but also I saw that their male pattern baldness actually started to regress and they started regaining some of their hair. And I think what you were talking about earlier, which is a really important point, is that when you improve your thyroid production, you also are getting better nutrient partitioning. So you're able to actually use the nutrients that you're getting rather than it just wasting away. So when you're in a hypothyroid state, you actually need so much more nutrients, because a lot of it's really just going to the shitter. Like you need some way to actually obtain that and get it to where you need it. So
yeah, exactly. So like I just want to add something. In a hypothyroid state, you typically have incomplete oxidation of the glucose and the fat that you consume. So if you can't properly oxidize the fat and glucose, you can't produce energy properly. That's why typically in people with diabetes, you see, and obesity sometimes, you see elevated increase in incomplete oxidized fatty acids. So beta oxidation is insufficient. Because the Krebs cycle and the whole mitochondria is just insufficient at producing the energy, it doesn't work properly. So the whole energy production system of the cell becomes dysfunctional. So using thyroid has actually been shown to reduce the incomplete oxidized fatty acids. So it enhances the complete oxidation of glucose and fat. So it normalizes that energy production that you're talking about.
Yeah, all comes back to energy again.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, looking at it as a system rather than this reductionistic view of one byproduct causing all these issues, I think just logically makes a lot more sense. And I think a lot of people will resonate with that. Looking at the time here, I'm just curious what else you wanted to cover about hair loss, if there's other things that were you had discovered in your research that you found fascinating?
I should say I can talk about IGF-1, but I want to talk about a little bit of DHT as well. So the dysregulation of the IGF-1 system has also been found to be implicated in hair loss. So I found an interesting study that showed that 5-alpha reductase is dependent on IGF-1 signaling. So when the IGF-1 system becomes dysfunctional, that free IGF-1 will stimulate 5-alpha reductase, and you will end up with an increase in DHT. So which is the root cause? Most likely the IGF-1 system that becomes dysregulated. And the IGF-1 system that's almost always dysregulated in almost all pathological conditions, including cancer, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, those kind of stuff. So IGF-1 system IGF-1 is being regulated by its binding proteins. Like for example, binding protein 1 to 5, I think, that transports this IGF-1 to prevent the access of free IGF-1. So the IGF-1 binding protein 3 specifically is reduced in balding tissue. So you specifically want to use stuff like zinc, magnesium, and selenium that can upregulate the binding protein 3 to modulate the IGF-1 system better to prevent hair loss. So now you end up with an increase in DHT, but there's so many controversies and paradoxes when it comes to DHT that causes hair loss. Like I mentioned, DHT on its own does not actually cause hair loss. It does not cause the shrinkage of the hair follicles. There's actually a very interesting study in, it was both an in vitro with human hair follicles, and it was, as they did a follow-up, they did 2 experiments in one study. So one was with mice or rodents, I can't exactly remember, but the other one was hair follicles. So they treated the hair follicles with different concentrations of DHT, and the same thing with the mice or rats. And they found that and too low concentrations of DHT, hair follicle growth was impaired. And at the optimal level of DHT, it actually stimulated the hair follicle hair growth. And then when it was too high, like if you were to take something like 50 milligrams plus of DHT on the scalp, it might potentially inhibit the growth of the hair follicle. Now, you know, like if you take 50 milligrams of DHT topically on the scalp, that's not the amount that you will be producing naturally. Even that conversion on the scalp in balding people is not even that high. So the point being is that the concentration that they gave the hair follicles and the rodents was actually higher, slightly higher than what they produced on default. So having slightly higher than normal levels of DHT actually promoted the hair follicle growth and stimulated hair growth in general. Like it healed, what's the right word, cured the hair loss in these rodents, and it was proved also by that in vitro hair follicle study. So actually DHT can help to stimulate proper growth, and that's what we see. Like DHT promotes hair growth everywhere else in the body, except apparently here. So the thing is, like, this is where the controversy comes in. Why does DHT stimulate hair growth everywhere else in the body, except it stimulates the hair loss here? So when they do an in vitro study, do they take the hair follicle from here or here, right? But if they take it, regardless from where they take it, that DHT will have exact same effect regardless of where you take that hair follicle. But suddenly, if it's in vivo in humans, it will cause hair loss only here. That implicates, or that says to me, that DHT is not the cause of hair loss, because like it's not causing it here, but it's causing it here. And this like, anyway, so the point being is they have not determined why that is. And DHT does not cause it in hair follicles, basically. There's something else that is driving the hair loss. And that other factors would be a loss of CO2, increase in aldosterone, parathyroid hormone, increase in intracellular calcium, all of these things that we just talked about. So, and also another thing I'd like to mention is that actually men that like 60 or older actually tend to get a decrease in 5-alpha reductase in the scalp. And the study showed that finasteride would not be useful for those men because they already have low 5-alpha reductase in the scalp while they're balding. So while you have low DHT, you're still balding. It's like, so clearly the DHT is not causing it. You need to be focusing on something else.
Right. Possibly the estrogen. I mean, if you think about average middle-aged man in America, they're bound to have some sort of estrogen issue. Just even as you were suggesting, the ratio is what's really important. You know, when your testosterone goes from here down to middle of the range, even and your estrogen stays the same, that ratio is going to be a lot different than it was when you were younger in your 20s. Yeah, the study you just mentioned is very fascinating to me, and it reminds me of a study that I saw that was very similar with rats, and I think they used thyroid in that case, and they found very similar things. And if you think about it, like with the Ray Peat philosophy, really what we're trying to mimic is the metabolism of a child. What do children do? Grow hair really, really fast. They grow nails really fast. They grow everything really fast because their metabolism is so high. And I think if we are able to mimic that, I think the study was showing that when they gave thyroid to, I don't know if it was in vivo or if it was rats, but whoever they gave it to, the amount of hair production they had on the whole body drastically increased and actually reversed any sort of male pattern baldness that they may have had. So that's super fascinating to me. And I think, yeah, it all comes down to getting the system functioning properly again.
Yeah, I've seen a study just last week that the thyroid levels of children are significantly higher, especially free T3. That's what matters. That's the active thyroid hormone that stimulates the tissue in the way we want. So children typically have, like, the younger they are, the higher the thyroid hormone. So a child of the age of about 7 had a free T3 level of 6+ p-mol per liter. That's kind of like high. Yeah. And then by 15, it was between 5 and 6 p-mol per liter. And the most men that I work with have between 3 and 4 p-mol per liter. So you typically want it like roughly at 5 p-mol per liter when you have thyroid. That's when you have more in the euthyroid range. And the thing is, like, they keep shifting the reference range down and down and down and down. It's like, if you have a 3 p-mol per liter, you're still normal. Yeah. Which is actually basically hypothyroid symptoms. That's when people have all these hypothyroid symptoms.
Yeah. Yeah. Another really interesting point about the DHT study is it's very well known that raising androgens such as testosterone, DHT, pregnenolone, and DHEA, that they actually will mimic thyroid in many ways and help the conversion of T4 into T3, which is the active form. So another theory could be that by raising your androgens, so long as you're getting enough nutrients in and caloric demands for that increase, you're increasing your thyroid production naturally as well without even taking thyroid. So in my case, using pregnenolone, DHEA, K2, whatever it may be, just improving your diet as well, raising your testosterone and DHT, that alone should help with the conversion of T4 to T3, and thus might make it so that you don't need to rely on thyroid from a supplement standpoint. So, yeah.
Estrogen has actually been shown to deactivate T4 into reverse T3, which blocks the effects of T3, and it also enhances the conversion of T3 into T2, a much weaker metabolite. So estrogen in general does have an anti-thyroid effect, which is obviously the opposite of what you want, as thyroid helps to promote the regrowth of your hair.
Yeah, super cool. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I don't know if there's anything that you want to cover before we end the show, but this has been great.
This has been great. I think we covered a lot. I can't think of anything else to add right at the moment.
Yeah, that was awesome. I'm really looking forward to getting this out and having people take a listen. Please let Hans or me know. You can find me on the Ray Peat forum as well as Hans, or you can feel free to contact me. I'll leave all our contact information below. Love to hear your thoughts on this show. Hans, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And
thanks for having me on, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.
Much guys for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed that show. I really enjoyed it myself, and I look forward to speaking with him in the future. I just wanted to quickly note before you guys hop off that Hans on mentalite.com is going to have a published article written by himself regarding this whole topic that we just covered today. Just a little bit more in depth and linking some scientific journals and research that he has found himself regarding hair loss. So definitely look out for that. I'll link it down in the description below once it's posted. And I think you guys will really enjoy reading that if you liked this podcast. Have a good day, guys. Bye.